Okay, why don't we get going? I'll be letting people in as they join us if they do, but I wanted to get ourselves going so we can keep ourselves on a good schedule. Welcome everybody. I'm Chet Kerr. I am the head of the Pollinator Pathway Project here in the River Towns, along with many other folks that are working hard on these issues. The Pollinator Pathway Project mission, as many of you know, is to engage and educate the community about pollinators and native plants and reducing pesticides, promoting public awareness about the crucial role that pollinators play, and raising awareness about and preserving and protecting open space and parks. Just a quick note about tonight's presentation. We will be having a question and answer session at the end, but you feel free to put questions in the chat as things go along, and hopefully Melissa will be able to answer those during the question and answer session. I also want to let everybody know that we are recording tonight's presentation as well. Before we turn to tonight's program, I wanted to mention one item. There's a really interesting talk that's being presented on Thursday, November 4th at 7 p.m. by the Town of Gardner Environmental Conservation Commission. It's about invasive ornamental plants that continue to be sold in local nurseries and garden centers. Mike Nelson, who teaches at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, will discuss the types of invasive plants for sale and the ongoing spread of invasive plants by the plant trade industry and what we can do about it. So it's an interesting topic apropos to what we do generally in our area. But tonight we're very lucky to be hearing from Melissa Reavis, who lives in Hastings-on-Hudson with her family, and who directs the residential studio at Hollander Design in New York City. Melissa is a registered landscape architect in New York and in New Jersey. And as part of her job, she actively is involved with designing gardens and outdoor spaces. Drawing on her own work with entomologists, Melissa has studied the relationship between mosquitoes and ticks and native plants. And tonight she's going to talk about why it's important to learn about mosquitoes and ticks and what role they play in nature and how to control their population in our gardens. So if everybody, please welcome Melissa. Take it away, Melissa.
Thank you. All right, so good evening, everyone. I'm just so glad we were able to get a small crowd of people to join us to talk about mosquitoes tonight. So I hope you all find this super informative and little entertaining too. Chet gave such a wonderful introduction, but I'm going to just tell you a little bit more about myself and my company, because all of the beautiful images that you're going to see tonight from this presentation are from our own portfolio. I can't take credit for some of the mosquito images, but all the beautiful gardens are Hollander's own. So as Chet said, my name is Melissa Reavis. I'm a member of our local Pollinator Pathway group, and I've been a landscape architect for over 17 years. And I'm currently the residential studio director at this wonderful place, Hollander Design. We have a staff of, sorry everyone, if you could just mute yourself, that would be helpful. So this is some of the work that we're doing at Hollander, and we have a staff of more than 30 landscape architects, environmental planners, and horticulturists who work across our 3 offices in New York City, the Hamptons, and Chicago. We design landscapes at every scale and all over the world, and we work with homeowners and architects and developers and institutions on projects of all sizes. So my interest in the subject really grew out of the work we're doing with pollinators in our office. We have so many wonderful clients who've allowed us to take large areas of their property and start turning them over to meadows and native gardens and pollinator habitats. And then last year, we were checking in on a couple of our completed projects, and I noticed that even on those sites where our clients were on board with pollinators, I still saw those little flags everywhere in the ground announcing that a pesticide had been applied. And I thought for sure our clients were probably just nervous about ticks because, I mean, we're all nervous about ticks. But when we started to ask, what are you spraying for here? Every answer came back as mosquitoes. And of course, we started to see the effects of spraying almost immediately, which was devastating. But the homeowners were told, this is safe, it's all natural, and on and on. And So instead of just relying on the advice that we were receiving from applicators, we decided to start doing our own research, and that led to our local Cornell Extension in Suffolk County, who connected us with researchers and entomologists, and then on to mosquito biologists, and it just kept snowballing from there. So a lot of the information in this presentation tonight is pulled from scientific papers that were given to us, and I've credited them whenever I could. I've also provided a ton of links at the end of this presentation for anyone that wants to read more about this. So this presentation began as a way to give our clients as much information as we could so that they could make the best decisions for themselves. And I'm happy to have an opportunity to share this with all of you because I think it can be so hard to find good information about pesticides when the majority of what you find online is provided by the applicators. So why mosquitoes? I give a lot of presentations about pollinators and their health and importance, but mosquitoes and other pests will always be tied to beneficial insects. It's important to learn about them as well. And we should also learn about them because they can be deadly. The CDC refers to mosquitoes as the world's deadliest animal for good reason. They can cause more than 700,000 deaths around the world each year from the diseases that they carry. And some of you may remember that in 1999, Queens was actually the center of the first West Nile virus outbreak that spread throughout the country. So Culex mosquitoes that carry and spread West Nile still do pose a threat to New Yorkers, though we've only had, I believe, only one confirmed case this year. And again, we do have the potential for mosquito-borne diseases like West Nile, Zika, dengue, malaria, because we have the populations of mosquitoes that can carry that disease here. So again, no confirmed cases, so no need to panic. But these are the diseases that are monitored by the Westchester County Department of Health. So before we get into the different control measures that are out there, I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the possible ecosystem services that mosquitoes may provide, because I know from my own conversations with researchers that the number one question they get asked is, can't we just eliminate all mosquitoes? They're disease vectors, they kill millions of people. You know, what possible benefit could they provide that would make up for that? And the answer may be none, no benefit, but the problem is we don't really know. And what we do know is that once a species becomes extinct, there's really no way to come back from that. So before we hypothetically wipe them off from the face of the earth, I'm going to tell you about a few areas of interesting research that I've found. So believe it or not, mosquitoes are pollinators. In fact, mosquitoes' primary food source is nectar, not blood. So just like bees or butterflies, mosquitoes transfer pollen from flower to flower as they feed. It's only when a female mosquito needs to lay eggs does she seek a blood meal for the protein. Mosquito pollination is likely far more common than we even realize, and there's evidence that mosquitoes function as generalist pollinators, which is an important note because many of our native bees and insects are considered specialists because their mouth parts only allow them to access nectar from very specific flower types. So I feel like I should be giving trigger warnings for some of these slides. There's going to be a lot of mosquitoes and ticks, so I apologize. But mosquitoes have great pollination services and incredibly important in some regions of the world. So during the summer months, the Arctic tundra has the highest concentration of mosquitoes on the planet. There's so many that they swarm in the millions, and they are the main source of pollination there. Mosquitoes are also a food source for many animals and other insects, but whether they're an important enough source is still hotly debated. So some researchers feel that they're not a particularly great source of food given their small size and kind of lack of nutrition. But overall, we know that their biomass is so large that this is an idea that has to be studied in more detail. And in my references, I've actually linked to a recent study in France that's helping researchers learn a lot more about mosquitoes' role. So I'll give you the quick summary, but some mosquito biologists have studied 2 wetland areas for many years. One that had been treated with BTI, which is an insecticidal bacteria and one that had not. They specifically watched the bird population there to see how this would affect them. And what they noticed is probably what you would assume, is that the birds in the areas that had been treated had to work much harder to find food. So these birds spent more time foraging, and in the end, they had fewer chicks that survived long enough to leave the nest. For years, the implications and benefits of eradication have been studied through similar studies like this. And some ecologists feel like these ecosystem services might eventually be filled by other insects, but others feel like eradication is something we might regret for some unseen reasons. So I'm only going to briefly touch on this idea as it came up in a conversation I had with a researcher, but this is a field that seems to still be needs some study. So obviously humans are not the only species that are affected by the diseases carried by mosquitoes. And this area of study is documented more frequently in other parts of the world. So, back to the Arctic for a minute, caribou are the main blood donors to mosquitoes on the north slopes of Alaska. And they're only able to escape mosquitoes by running as fast as they can or jumping into a lake. And more mosquitoes means more running and less eating, leading to stressed and unhealthy caribou populations. The mosquito is their only predator currently, and it keeps the population in check. So some studies are now relating this to other species, and some universities are studying mosquitoes' relationship with the white-tailed deer. And again, because we don't fully have the full picture of their relationship with other species, we can't fully understand the consequences of their removal from an ecosystem. It seems impossible that our deer situation could get any worse here, but that could be a possibility. Okay, so this is one of my fun deep dives into just random historical events that were clearly shaped by mosquitoes. So this particular example has to do with the American Revolution. So we probably all know a little bit about the American Revolution, taxes, Boston Tea Party, George Washington, and maybe you even know a little bit about the battle at Yorktown, which eventually led to the end of the war. But I bet few of you know the outsized role that mosquitoes played in that encounter. So these two maps show the march of General Cornwallis and his British troops leading up to that battle. So he's zigzagging all over the place because he couldn't find a healthy spot for his troops to rest. Colonial malaria was raging at that time, and our own soldiers had become seasoned to it. They had all had it, and they probably have had it multiple times by that point, and they all developed an immunity. Well, the British soldiers were cut to pieces in the marshlands of Virginia. And you probably can't see the dates on this map, but this was June and July and August, prime mosquito time in their prime habitat. General Cornwallis starts sending letters to British loyalists and Southern colonies asking them, where can I find a healthy spot? And because they're all seasoned to it too, they say, what are you talking about? Just go that way or this way. And by the time he gets there, and his troops are just cut to pieces by malaria again. So only 35% of his troops were even able to stand by the time Washington arrived, which eventually led to Cornwallis's surrender. So this is just a small example, but the Anopheles mosquito is practically a founding mother of the United States. Without her intervention, there's no way of telling that battle would have had the same outcome. And then conservation, there's this great article by David Quammen, who's a fairly well-known science writer, titled Sympathy for the Devil, where he laid out a few interesting ideas about how mosquitoes may be offering ecosystem services. And he says that with only a small bit of squinting, mosquitoes could be seen as one of the great ecological heroes of planet Earth, especially if you consider rainforest preservation. So the chief point of blame with mosquitoes happens to be the chief point of merit here. They make tropical rainforests for humans virtually uninhabitable. But they're still constantly under siege. They're being clear cut for cattle ranching, subsistence agriculture, mined for wood, and on and on. And conservation groups and governments are constantly tossing money at the problem. But no one and no thing has done more to delay this catastrophe over the past 10,000 years than the mosquito. The threat of yellow fever and malaria, dengue, and so many other diseases just keep people at bay. Because if you clear the vegetation from the brink of a jungle waterhole and move in with tents and jeeps, the Anopheles mosquito, which is not normally native there, but's now found everywhere, will arrive in a month, bringing malaria. And if you cut the tall timber from 5 acres of rainforest, a viral transmitting Aedes mosquito, which would normally live out its lives high in the forest canopy, will fall down on you and start spreading yellow fever. So as Europe was being stripped of its virgin woods in India and China and the North American heartland, the tropical rainforest largely escaped, lasting into the 20th century. But the largest remaining tropical rainforest, the Amazon, is under substantial pressure right now. Brazil's government-sponsored settlement of the Amazon has led to huge amounts of deforestation, which led me to another amazing paper titled Amazon Deforestation Drives Malaria Transmission and Malaria Burden Reduces Forest Clearing. So a group of researchers at Stanford University have actually been able to prove this idea that the burden of malaria has led to a form of conservation in these areas. And as someone who often advocates for conservation areas for our native pollinators, it's amazing to see an insect essentially doing the hard work for itself and to see the immediate effect on human lives. I mean, when you take away the habitat of this insect, our lives as humans are directly affected in a negative way. And if we start controlling mosquito populations in the rainforest, we most certainly will see an uptick in deforestation. With all that said, pollination, conservation, mosquitoes acting as war generals, with the understanding that mosquitoes play a larger role in our ecosystem, I still believe that if it were possible to press a button and eliminate all of the Anopheles mosquitoes on Earth, I would be on board to press that button, because I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here, but malaria is easily the world's worst parasite. Over 230 million people get malaria every year, and most of the people that die from it are children. And we were incredibly lucky to have eliminated malaria from the United States. The CDC ran a successful campaign in the late 40s to eradicate malaria. And by 1951, the CDC declared that it had been eradicated. And we did this through what you're seeing here, an intensive DDT spray program. We applied it to the interior surfaces of people's homes. We sprayed entire premises from the air, from trucks, from backpack sprayers. It was a huge undertaking. And in the years after World War II, DDT was associated with patriotism because it was used to keep our troops healthy and our victory gardens pest-free. And it was often touted as being very safe by manufacturers and media. But even then, scientists said they only tolerated the use of this chemical because it was considered less devastating than the threats of malaria and yellow fever. And back then, polio was thought to be spread by flies, so that misconception worked in DDT's favor too. But when these threats went away, the public finally took a hard look at DDT and its consequences. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in the early 60s, called attention to how chemicals were adversely affecting the environment. But the eradication, luckily, was complete, and we've been benefiting ever since. And we're currently still spraying. Today, many vector control operations use pyrethroids instead, which are synthetic versions of the natural pesticide pyrethrum, which is derived from chrysanthemum flowers. And the nozzles, which you can see on the right, on modern mosquito foggers, make the droplets of the spray very, very tiny, so they stick to mosquitoes' wings well and not to other insects. Applications are also timed to when mosquitoes are most active. So for instance, the Culex mosquito, they bite in the morning and in the evenings when native bees are actually less active. So it's much easier to control them with spray programs. But the Aedes mosquito, like Aedes aegypti, which is currently causing issues in California, those are daytime biters, and that makes them a bit harder to fight with just chemicals. Aerial applications are also more precise than they once were. Planes now just use a sugar packet's worth of pesticide over an acre in closely monitored applications. However, the companies that perform these services privately are not necessarily using this latest technology and will often spray an entire yard indiscriminately with no regard when pollinators are most active. So if you currently spray your property and they're out there in the middle of the day, they are wasting your money because the mosquitoes are elsewhere. They're hiding under leaves, they're in the woods, they're not hanging out in your yard all day. And I want to point that another strategy that the US is only now starting to use is to rotate the types of pesticides so that our mosquito populations don't develop a resistance to any control method. And unfortunately, we're starting to see that today. The world still relies on the same class of insecticides as it did in 1977. So now these compounds may be nearing the end of their useful lives as mosquitoes develop resistance to them at alarming rates. And there's little in the pipeline to replace them. So scientists knew that resistance was inevitable. DDT, again, played a major role in driving down malaria cases in the 40s and 50s, but in many cases, resistance completely reversed those gains. So in Sri Lanka, for instance, malaria was all but wiped out with the help of DDT. But by the end of the 1960s, when resistance was widespread, cases surged to more than 500,000 a year. So many scientists have their hopes pinned on some new approaches to vector control that would be less likely to run into resistance or prove toxic, such as mosquitoes genetically modified to die young, traps that lure the insects to their death, or insecticidal bacteria fungi. We need to diversify in terms of the kind of tools that we use to control mosquitoes and not only to focus on it as a chemical control. So I'm going to narrow the focus now to just our Westchester mosquitoes. So we're, peak season in New York usually lasts from April until October, and it's expected to get even longer due to climate change. In fact, meteorologists just recently changed New York City's classification from a humid continental climate zone to a humid subtropical climate zone, which unfortunately is an ideal environment for mosquitoes to thrive. And their activity spikes when temperatures reach 70 degrees. So the more consecutive days we have at 70 plus degrees, the more they'll be able to breed successfully, and we'll see their numbers spike. And as our local conditions begin to change and mimic other weather patterns around the world, we'll have to keep the lesson of the Amazon rainforest in mind. When we clear areas of current habitat for mosquitoes, we will see an increase in vector-borne diseases. There's a million great reasons to advocate for conservation, and this is just one more reason to add to that list. So I'm going to give you a couple of facts that are key when you're trying to battle a mosquito issue on your own property. So there are 3,500 species of mosquitoes in the world. Approximately 70 of them are known to live in New York. And there are 112 genera, but you're likely to only hear about 3 because of the diseases that they transmit. So Anopheles transmits malaria, Aedes transmits yellow fever, dengue, and the genus Culex transmits West Nile. Contrary to popular belief, the majority of mosquitoes do not feed on people. In Westchester, we have 4 species of mosquitoes that might. Another trigger warning, there's going to be a lot of mosquitoes coming up here. So these are our 4 most common. The Culex, the northern house mosquito. This is our most common, and it has a very small territory. It usually stays within 300 feet from its breeding site. So ensuring there are no breeding sites on your property actually goes a long way to protecting you from Culex mosquitoes. Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito. These are actually rarely seen in Westchester County. I only included them because they're very common in New York City, and in the heat of the summer, we do see some at the lower ends of Westchester. The next one is a salt marsh mosquito. That's another Aedes, and these are found, as you can imagine, in coastal areas. And both of these Aedes mosquitoes are known to be aggressive and painful biters. And it's also important to note that these 2 feed during the day. The Culex and the Anopheles are both nighttime feeders. So if you're getting bit during the day, it's important to know that you're most likely being bit by that salt marsh mosquito. In salt marsh, mosquitoes will fly several miles from breeding sites to seek blood meals. So if you're being bit by them in the middle of the day, they're not likely to be on your property. They're probably coming from somewhere farther away. And the Anopheles. This, again, is the mosquito that transmits malaria, and they will breed in both fresh and brackish waters. And again, although malaria does not normally occur in New York, there have been some rare occurrences in our area. And this is, again, what I was talking about. It's really important to know, to really take a look at when you're being bit on your property, because that goes a long way in helping you to fight the problem on your own, in your own garden. So if you're being bit during the day, again, those mosquitoes are probably coming from much further away. They're probably coming from coastal environments. If you're being bit at night or at dawn, then you're most likely being bit by a culex, and their best thing that you can do is just to go around your property and try to eliminate pools of water. So last month, the Westchester County Health Department confirmed we had our first known human case of West Nile this year. And you may have read about this. And whenever they report on a new case, they tend to go into the batches of mosquitoes that were collected and how many tested positive. So I'm just going to briefly touch on this. Each year, the health department traps and collects mosquitoes 3 to 4 times a week at all of the locations shown here. The mosquitoes are sorted by species and submitted in batches to a local laboratory. This allows us to track individual areas and isolate control measures if they're ever needed. So whenever somebody does test positive for West Nile, the health department staff visits their home, visits the surrounding neighborhood, and they try to identify and eliminate any potential breeding areas. So as a county, we do quite a bit. The health department works hard to eliminate breeding grounds. They distribute minnows to county residents. They apply larvicide treatments to our catch basins and municipal drainage systems. And if disease-bearing mosquitoes ever do become a serious threat, the county will apply pesticides. So it's my understanding that they haven't done that since 2000. So in addition to those county services, there's plenty that individual homeowners can do to keep mosquito populations at bay. So removing things that collect water, such as buckets, wheelbarrows, toys, storage containers, furniture. Cover your outdoor trash containers to keep rainwater from accumulating. Drill holes in the bottom of recycling containers. And encourage proper drainage in your lawn areas with good maintenance. So make sure you're aerating your lawn as a part of your yearly maintenance. If you're noticing standing water for long periods of time, call someone to help install French drains or wicks or rain gardens so that you can help keep that water moving. I briefly mentioned the minnow program, but residents with ornamental ponds can add something called fathead minnows, or they're also called, I think, mosquito fish. And the minnows eat mosquito larvae, and that prevents them from maturing into adults. So last year, Westchester County gave away 250 pounds of minnows for free to residents. And they do that every year in April. They also give away something called mosquito dunks, which can be used in bird baths or smaller water features or drip trays of planters, anywhere water collects for a long period of time. So the dunks have a bacterial larvicide called BTI again, and it keeps larvae from, again, developing into adults. It's completely safe, non-toxic to people, will not harm pets or animals, and it's also safe for other insects like bees. So if you're not treating with BTI, then you should drain water in your bird bath. So, make sure you're changing out the water in plant pots and drip trays and bird baths and fountains at least twice a week. Clean and chlorinate your swimming pools, outdoor saunas, hot tubs. Keep them empty if they're not being used. And if you're putting a pool cover on it, make sure you're emptying the water off of that regularly. And construct your goldfish ponds properly. Large goldfish are unable to reach sloping edges of ponds where mosquitoes breed, so be sure your pond has vertical sides. A pond fountain will also help reduce mosquito breeding because it keeps the water from being stagnant at the edges. And I just want to also point out that if residents notice large areas of standing water on public property, you can also report that to the Westchester County Department of Health, and they will send somebody out immediately to check in on it. So spray programs. I know I touched on municipal spray programs and how they've become much better, but unfortunately, most of the local applicators are not necessarily going to have that latest technology. So the most widely used residential mosquito sprays are still highly toxic to native pollinators, fish, etc. So here's what you need to know before you start spraying. Most residential control companies are using pyrethrins, which are that broad spectrum insecticide. And as I mentioned earlier, we're beginning to see a resistance to pyrethrins in mosquitoes. And if we continue to spray just to keep regular non-disease vector mosquitoes away, we're only increasing the possibility that our local mosquitoes would become resistant to sprays. And then when the time comes when we have an outbreak in West Nile or Zika or, God forbid, malaria, we'll have one less weapon to fight this. It's the same reason why doctors don't prescribe antibiotics unless it's absolutely necessary, because we do not want to lose that tool to fight future diseases. So if you absolutely must spray, just please be sure to spray at night when most of our pollinators are not at their most active and mosquitoes are more likely to be biting. And then at the end of the day, the absolute best thing you can do is just protect yourself. Cover up with loose fitting, lightweight clothing from dusk to dawn. Most mosquitoes are ankle biters. So if you wear long socks, you can go a long way to protecting yourselves. Use repellents properly, read their labels. Use clothing treated with permethrin. Make sure that you're checking the screens on your windows, make sure they're all in good repair, and just avoid areas of standing water at night. That's when they're always going to be at their most active. Okay, and I just want to talk about a couple final tips for mosquitoes. So to avoid getting bitten, it's really important to understand what attracts them to us in the first place. So there are several ways that mosquitoes sense people, and certain people more than others. Heat. So mosquitoes are drawn towards body heat to help them find targets to feed on, and people that generate more heat are more likely to get bitten. CO2, mosquitoes can detect CO2 from up to 30 feet away. So heavy breathing, such as during exercise, again, is more likely to attract mosquitoes. Sweat, mosquitoes are attracted to both water vapor and lactic acid, which are produced when people sweat. There's a lot of studies that say that mosquitoes are much more attracted to your feet when you're sweating. So making sure you're wearing shoes and long socks can go a long way to help protect you. Dark colors. So this one was a little bit surprising. So research has shown that mosquitoes are attracted to dark colors, particularly black. And so you would assume because they're pollinators, they would be attracted to bright colors, but when they are taking a blood meal, that does not seem to be the case. And alcohol consumption. So there was a 2002 study that showed that people who consumed beer specifically were more attracted to mosquitoes than those who did not. And I just also want to point out something really quickly. I get a lot of people that comment and say like, I got bitten a lot more when I was pregnant, or I feel like my child gets bitten a lot more than me. And if you look through these 5 things I just pointed out, it becomes really clear why people are being bitten. So a pregnant person, when you are pregnant, your internal body temperature does rise. You're also carrying around a lot of additional weight, so you're probably breathing much heavier. And again, because you're hotter and you're carrying around a lot more weight, you're probably sweating more. So all of these things stand to reason that yes, a pregnant person would get bitten more. Children for the same thing. Children tend to run hotter. And I know from my son specifically, he seems to be sweaty always. So he does get bitten a lot more than me and my husband. One other thing that people ask all the time is, are mosquitoes more attracted to certain blood types? There is some evidence that yes, type O is slightly more attractive to mosquitoes. But I want to also point out that if you find that you're getting bitten more than maybe a friend of yours that's sitting right next to you, that is not necessarily what's happening. So not everyone shows an immune response when they're bitten. So if you look like your legs have been bitten up, it's much more likely you've been bitten a couple of times and you're showing hives, whereas your friend just might be more seasoned to a mosquito bite. It's important to know that because a lot of people do not protect themselves if they think they're the type that don't get bitten. But yes, even if you're not showing hives, you're just as likely to be bitten. So I have a lot of links at the end of this presentation, but here are a couple that I think are worth bookmarking because they have such great information. So the Westchester government's, their health department website is full of great information, and they will tell you when those free services are being offered. So I would bookmark that. The EPA's website has valuable information regarding repellents. They have a little form that you can fill out, and that will tell you the best one for you and your family. Rockland County's website, for whatever reason, is incredibly full of information. They have a lot of different PDFs that you can download, and I would absolutely send anybody there. And then the National Wildlife Federation blog is so wonderfully written, and they have an entire series on mosquitoes. So I would press you all to go check that out. Okay, on to our next incredibly uplifting topic of ticks. I'm only going to briefly touch on this topic because there's a wealth of information out there, and we are incredibly lucky to have a world-class institution doing some of the best research on ticks in our backyard. So the Carey Institute is located in Millbrook, and they've just wrapped a 5-year study looking at 2 potential tick control methods to determine whether these controls can reduce disease-carrying ticks in cases of tick-borne illness. So our region is a hotbed of tick research because, as you can see by this diagram, we are unfortunately at the epicenter. Oh Lord, another trigger warning here. So before I jump into the study, just a quick reminder of the 3 ticks that you're most commonly see in our area. The dog tick transmits Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia. And while the dog tick is common, those 2 diseases are pretty rare. The Lone Star tick transmits ehrlichiosis, and they also transmit something called alpha-gal, but these 2 are still fairly uncommon in our area, much more common in Long Island. The black-legged tick, or more commonly known as a deer tick, is the vector for the 3 tick-borne diseases that occur most commonly in our region: Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. Lyme disease is by far the most common tick-borne disease here. About 95% of all the Lyme disease cases in New York State come from the Hudson Valley, with higher rates of disease in the counties east of the Hudson River, which is probably bad news for everybody watching right now. The Carey Institute is putting 30 years of science into a major study that just wrapped up. So the Tick Project, again, it's that 5-year, 24 neighborhood study where they've tested 2 control methods. Method 1 on the left is a tick control system, or TCS, and it's a small bait box that attracts rodents. When an animal enters the box, it receives a low dose of fipronil, the active ingredient in Frontline. The bait box is child resistant, contains a non-toxic bait block that tracks rodents that enter the block to feed, and then they receive a treatment. The pesticide kills the ticks on contact, and it will continue to kill ticks that they come in contact with for the next several weeks. So this completely interrupts the transmission cycle of Lyme disease. The concentration of fipronil on the bait boxes is 10 times lower than what you would put on a pet. So the chemical is also safe for predators. A predator would have to consume something like 600,000 mice that had been treated to experience even a mild effect from the chemical. And I want to stress that these are tick boxes, and they're not to be confused with tick tubes, which you may have also seen. The tick tubes are stuffed with cotton that's been treated with a similar pesticide. Then the rodent takes that cotton back to its nest to be used as bedding. And there have been a lot of studies on tick tubes, and they're just not nearly as successful as the boxes because not all rodents create nests like mice. So for example, chipmunks are apparently not interested in taking the cotton with them. They're also not great for kids or cats because they're accessible, they're not locked. Method number 2 is on the right, and it's Met 52, and that's a fungal spray. So metarrhizum is a fungus that occurs naturally in forest soils in eastern North America, and it's been shown to kill ticks. A strain of this fungus, Met 52, has been developed as a commercial product, and it's currently being used in the agricultural industry. So the spray is applied to plants in the surrounding soil, and when a tick comes in contact with it, the fungal spores stick to the tick. And when the spores sprout, the fungus grows through the tick's outer covering and eventually kills the tick. Ticks are usually killed within 3 to 7 days of exposure to Met 52 spores. The fungus is non-toxic for infants, children, adults, dogs, cats, and other mammals. The EPA has determined that no harm will be caused by people coming in contact with it, and it's also approved its use in residential areas as a bioinsecticide. And the Kerry chose these methods of tick control because, again, they've been shown to be safe. They've also been already proven to kill ticks, and they only considered methods that were already commercially available to avoid delays in applying useful results from this study to the real world. So currently, the Kerry Institute is waiting on some peer review before they can finally release the paper, but in our dealings with them, they've made it pretty clear that they think this is a viable and safe strategy. And hopefully they'll be able to release that paper soon. So I would keep an eye out for that. And please visit their website. And if you can, donate money to support them. And I have more links at the end for some of the research that they've done to date. In the meantime, if you feel like you'd like to take a step to make your yards and gardens a bit safer, these would be the 2 products that I recommend. And so there's just a lot of other things you can do to stay safe when you're outside in the landscape. So first is just to know when you're going to be at most risk. So 2/3 of all cases of Lyme disease are reported in June, July, and August. And that's our prime tick season here. But just to note, remember that you can pick up ticks year round because the black-legged tick does overwinter in Westchester County. Try to avoid their habitat whenever possible. Stay on paths, stay out of leaf litter and tall brush. This picture is actually a great example of where ticks thrive in dunes, so stay on boardwalks. When I have to go into environments like this, I wear a full Tyvek suit. Use repellents whenever you're outside. I put on repellents every day that I'm in the landscape for an extended period of time, even when I'm in my own garden. Wear light colored clothing, treat it with permethrin. And the absolute best thing you can do is just check yourself every day. Take a shower as soon as you come inside from the garden. And if you can't shower right away, I take a lint roller to my clothing and it helps pull off ticks that are too small to see. So I keep one in my car, and after we're done hiking, I roll my clothes before I get back in. Okay, I really just want to thank all of you for sticking through what I'm sure was a somewhat depressing lecture on pests. But because we all know mosquitoes and ticks are not going anywhere, and the best thing we can do is to keep ourselves informed, hopefully we'll be able to post these slides for you somewhere, because this is one well-researched talk, I promise. And there's so much valuable information here. So bookmark the Westchester County Health Department website, bookmark the Kerry Institute, and just stay informed. And garden smart, create spaces that are safe for your family, create buffers for yourself. A 3-foot wide barrier of gravel does a lot to restrict tick migration. Keep the edges of your beds mowed. Smart garden design allows safe spaces for your family and areas for nature too, without resorting to chemicals. So thank you again. Thank you, Chet. And hopefully I've left enough time for some questions.
Melissa, thank you very much for an incredibly informative talk. I'm going to have to go back and watch it several times. But one question I did want to ask, let me jump in here. You and I had talked about whether, specifically with mosquitoes, there's certain plants certain native plants that tend to attract mosquitoes, that while you might think, oh, I'll just put these in my garden, it might make sense to place them further away so that they don't attract things like that. Is that true? Or maybe you could explain.
Yeah, well, so as I said before, they are general pollinators. So they do visit a wide range of flowers. So like the best thing you can do is if you have an area of your property that you like to sit at night, I would really suggest putting mostly grasses or things that don't need pollination, like this image, doing something like that around your seating area and keeping a lot of the flowers outside of your terrace goes a long way. But there are certain plants. There's a lot of research happening right now where for a long time, researchers focused on things that repelled mosquitoes, but now we're learning that there are specific plants that they seem to be attracted to. So yarrow is one of them. And interestingly enough, that is an ingredient in some sprays that to try to keep mosquitoes away. So that's actually been phased out. So no one uses that anymore, but it is an attractant. Solidago is another one that they seem to be more attracted to. And then there's a lot of ornamentals that they seem to also be attracted to. A lot of oranges, like the color orange seems to attract them. So all of that, I would just recommend keep it in your yard because again, you're always going to have mosquitoes in your property. There's nothing you can do about that, but you can keep them away from your seating areas.
In the chat, Melissa, there's a question from, you mentioned that mosquitoes have benefits of pollinators. Are ticks at all beneficial or are they just pests?
No, just pests, sadly. Yeah, they don't. So what they have looked into is whether they do offer other ecosystem services. So for example, they are a food source for certain mammals like possums eat ticks. But what they're finding is that they are so low nutrition for them that it's not even chickens. Like there is always this popular thought that they eat ticks and they benefit from them, but it's not they don't prefer it. No mammal prefers it. So no, they don't really provide much at all. And definitely not pollination services.
Another question from the chat. Can you address the spray programs offered by landscape companies as to the effectiveness against ticks? Many of those companies advertise tick control spray programs. Are they good or bad?
So unless they're specifically using MET 52 and you can ask them exactly what they're putting down on your property, no, most of them are not effective even. There's been a lot of studies about how long those sprays remain effective after you put them down. It is a very limited amount of time. So you might see a small drop for a few days, but it's not nearly as effective as those biofungal methods. So if they're using chemicals only, it is not effective. The amount of chemical that a tick has to come in contact with in order to die and to make it through that shell is an alarming amount. And so it's doing much more harm for you and other pollinators than it is for the tick population. We definitely do not recommend it.
So here's another question from the chat. Is there data on the use of cedar oil for the prevention of mosquitoes that you're aware of?
Yeah, so I thought about including this because there are a lot of different oils that get marketed as being a repellent, and they have like varying amounts of effectiveness. So those oils have to be reapplied a lot. And so I think what happens is that people don't think to reapply and then they put themselves at risk. The EPA, that is not one of the top recommendations from the EPA. They do recommend DEET first. Most of the researchers that I talk to all recommend DEET as what they use themselves. And I really had hoped I'd come across somebody that had like some really wonderful, not toxic product that I could use on my son. But no, now after doing this research for the past year, we've all moved to DEET in my own family.
So another question, you've mentioned MET 52 as an effective tool to deal with deer ticks. Are you know whether, or has there been any studies whether MET52 also affects other insects, other invertebrates, the same way it affects deer ticks?
Yeah, there is some research in this. So MET52 was originally developed for the agricultural industry, and so it was not originally developed for ticks. And so there is a long list of pesticide applications for MET52. And so if you read the label, it does have ticks, but it will also list all of the other things that it does kill. It is not harmful to bees. It's not harmful to butterflies. It's not harmful to most flying insects. What it is harmful for are some ground dwelling beetles. And they're doing a lot more research into that to see exactly if there is a application amount that works for ticks and might help keep some beetles safe. But no, flying insects are not at all harmed by this. And it really is about those spores getting into that exoskeleton. So those are the type of insects that are also going to be at risk.
Another question for a couple of people is, where can we purchase bait boxes, assuming the tick boxes that you mentioned?
So a lot of pest control companies you can purchase them through them, or they will come and they'll put them around your property. I think if you specifically Google the TCS box, there are some areas in Westchester County where you can purchase them. And the TCS, it just stands for tick control system. So if you look that up, you should be able to find some sources. And if not, I'll do a little bit of research and maybe I can pass that on to you, Chet, to give people some sources.
Another question. This is a little off target, but it's a good question, and that is, I'll read it. I'm fairly lucky in terms of mosquitoes. My worst problem as a gardener is Japanese beetles. Are any strategies? Are they getting worse? Any strategies on dealing with Japanese beetles?
No, it is my worst thing too. So the only thing I can say is that the larvae of Japanese beetles develop in your lawn. And so the more lawn you have, actually, the more Japanese beetles you have. And so we've been in our own property starting to slowly take lawn away to see if that helps our problem here. But no, we have the same issue. And if you treat for the beetle, it's just putting down another chemical. And I wish I had a great way, because I would be implementing it here, but no, I don't know of anything specifically for Japanese beetles.
I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. If anybody has a final one they'd like to put in, actually, here's one. Why are tick boxes so much more expensive than tick tubes? And also, why can they only be applied by certified technicians? Is that true? Can tick boxes only be applied by certified technicians?
I'm not sure of that. It might be because of the fipronil in it, like that chemical may have to be put down by a certified technician. But it was my understanding that both of those systems were readily available. The Carey Institute only tested things that they knew that the general public could get. So I don't know, I'll have to reach out to our contact there to get more information about that. But they're more expensive because there's more to it. The boxes are fairly large. They are lockable boxes. And so the idea is that the mouse or the chipmunk goes into the box, turns a corner to get that bait, and comes back out. So it needs to rub against the wick a few times. And so it's just a much more developed product than just a cardboard tube with cotton in it. So that's why they're just a more expensive method.
Okay, well, again, Melissa, thank you so much. We had great questions and a very, very informative talk. And I would invite folks, if you have other questions or other things you want to raise, you can either email Melissa directly, or you can email me and I'll pass it on to Melissa. But I just want to thank you for helping us think through a topic that affects us all every single day. So thank you. And I thank everybody else for joining us tonight. And we'll be back to you soon with our next Living Classroom program. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.